caught. So, no, that didn't even cross my mind that he would be hurt or floored by my use of his car for this purpose. And those aspects of Rader, to me, are his blind spots, the buffers he has put in place to keep his own narrative true to him, because that's a direct violation of his son's trust and certainly a challenge to Rader's claim that he loved his son, that he would do something like that with the possibility of getting caught and even having his son being brought in because it was his son's car. Now, fortunately, his son had an alibi because he was in the Navy. But if he hadn't, I mean, honestly, that you're really putting somebody at risk by doing that. It's hard for most of us to understand that as an aspect of a loving father, as Rader claims to be.
Yeah, it's really weird with him being such an organized serial killer and him at least trying to kind of have all his ducks in a row that he wouldn't consider that portion of it. But, you know, I guess he just got focused on other things. And one of those things go ahead.
We should talk about his attitude. There's an attitude that I've written quite a bit about called narcissistic immunity. Bundy had it as well, very evidently. Quite a few others have it. The idea is that they're so sure of their specialness, of their how smart they are, of that just they can't get caught, or if they get caught, they certainly wouldn't get convicted, or if convicted, they absolutely wouldn't get executed. In their minds, these things are impossible. Even as they're happening, they're impossible because they believe they're destined, they're special, they're superior to the average person. They've outsmarted, for Rader, he outsmarted the police for 30 years. Why wouldn't he think he's special? So it's more that attitude that I think was at play for him thinking he'll never get caught than anything else.
And to go along with that, he had his own specific training, and that's something that I wanted to talk about, too. One of the most terrifying things about him, and this is what people think about with Dennis Rader, is the fact that, you know, people were buying security systems in Wichita to protect themselves from B.T.K., and there he is working for ADT. Was that, and I don't know if he talked about it or not, I don't remember, was that something that he had, did he specifically choose a place like that because it afforded him new possibilities and training for his alternate life?
No, he did that with the criminal justice classes. He decided to go into criminal justice in part because he really hoped eventually he'd get to be a police officer, which would, of course, afford him all kinds of advantages in his criminal career. But when he got jobs, it tended to be toward the end of eventually becoming a police officer, so a security company would clearly be attractive to him. But it wasn't necessarily that easy just to go get these jobs, and I don't believe that he applied to ADT specifically so that he'd have an advantage of getting into victim homes. I think once he did have that job, he realized, wow, this really gives me a sense of the layout of the homes, the different types of security systems, how to dismantle them if I need to. So I think that was more it. The planning really had to do with when he took the criminal justice courses. But also some of his military training had helped with this as well.
Yeah, he's just the fact that he was involved in that line. And now I've heard a lot that these serial killers, like Ed Kemper, wanted to be a police officer. But, you know, it's just interesting that he was, I don't know, in his own way kind of honing his craft by doing that, which I guess is not that uncommon, is it?
It's not that uncommon. I can name quite a few who either aspired to be, or even if they didn't end up as officers, learned what they could, got fake badges, things like that. posed as officers or firemen or something like that. So it's not that uncommon.
What was his feelings about being captured? What was, and his reasoning for it? Did he kind of explain what he felt like he did wrong, or is
I don't know.
He
still obsesses over it. It wasn't that he was ignorant of computers, which is, I know I've seen some theories that say that he just didn't know what he was doing. He did. He had been using a computer at home, but something was wrong, I think, with the printer at home. And also he was fairly careful. He would go into libraries and whatnot to try to do that, but he was using a church computer at the time. And he had because he was a compliance officer, he did have access to police officers. And one day, a guy who was in the budding field of digital forensics, in other words, in those early days, cops knew very, very little about digital forensics. And Rader asked him whether something like, I think it was an email, could be traced. Like if it was anonymous and came from an anonymous source, could it be traced? And the guy told him no. The guy was wrong. Of course it could be traced. But the guy inadvertently gave him the wrong information, which he himself has admitted to and written an article about. So Rader now has that layer of narcissistic immunity, and now he believes that if he uses, a disk, he won't be traced. So he believes that, even though he actually asked the task force, Ken Landwehr, can you trace me if I were to send this? At this point, he had gotten tired of doing all the excessive copying that he'd been doing, because he would take something he printed out, then he'd copy it, and then he'd copy the copy for several generations of copies, because he already knew they had the ability to pinpoint certain copy machines. So he was making sure that he had erased his tracks that way. But he was getting tired. He had limited time to be able to do that, and he didn't know how to use a computer. So he asked them, "Can you trace a computer disk if I use that?" And they said no, lying to him. However, let me just say this: if he had used a completely clean one, it would have been much harder. What he did was he used one that he had already used for church notes. So his name was in the metadata or whatever it is where they found it. His name was on the disk as Dennis. And so it was fairly easy to trace it back to the computer of the church. They asked the minister, who named Dennis would have been using this computer. The minister told them it was Dennis Rader. They looked at his house. There's the SUV, from the surveillance video. Everything clicks. They then got some medical samples from his daughter's medical records to check DNA, et cetera. So time to move in and put him under arrest. Now, Rader's own feeling about that is that he was stupid to trust them. Why did he do that? He knows they'll lie, because that's something he's learned in his classes. Why did he do that? There's that narcissistic immunity. It gave him a blind spot. It made him believe he was too special, and that he had this relationship with them that they were enjoying, which they weren't, of course. But they had made him believe that they were friendly and they liked him, etc. So they played it well. And he was stupid, and he knows he was stupid about that. But had he used a completely clean new disk with no notes or anything like that, they still might have been able to track it, but they would have had a harder time, I think, identifying him.
That narcissistic immunity, that's something I wanted to rewind about. The fact that he wrote to the police in the first place, the fact that he was conning them, did he talk about why he was doing that? Why, why?
Yeah, I mean, what happened is,
in the first place?
And this comes back to his desire to have control. What happened was an attorney, Robert B.T.K, had decided to write a book about a 30-year retrospective about the B.T.K murders that were still unsolved. And at that point, they believed they had 7, although the task force thought there were potentially others associated with, but they had 7. So B.T. was going to write a book, and it was talked about in the newspaper. And Rader read about that, and he did not like that someone else was going to try to tell his story. That was first. At the same time, and this is kind of funny, I was writing at that time for Crime Library, the Court TV website, and we had run a story in B.T.K. It wasn't my story; it was another writer's story. And Rader saw that was also going up in a 30-year retrospective. So he actually used the chapter titles from the online story for his own. But what he decided to do was he would write his own story and he would give this to the police because he didn't like that B.T. was going to do it. And so at first it was a reaction to B.T., but then as he got going and he started doing the kinds of puzzles and stuff, which I think were inspired, frankly, by what the Zodiac had done in 1969. He found this to be more fun, and as they did not know what to make of it, and they started putting this stuff in the newspaper, talking about it on the local radio station, Rader felt great, and then he began to think about the audience as his fan club, and that he needed to keep supplying stuff to his fan club, keep his name out there. So it began to feed this ego, this narcissism that he had, and he really couldn't stop. He'd make stuff up, he'd pretend to have committed other crimes, just to see how the police would react to what he was doing.
You know, with him having such a well-known name value for serial killers, does he get a lot of prison correspondence? I assume like a lot of true crime enthusiasts probably write to him, but I'm curious if he has, you know, he doesn't seem like the type of guy that would have groupies, but you just never know.
Does. Yes, he does. He has a lot of correspondence, and he does have groupies. He has a number of people who claim they know he's the Zodiac or he committed these other crimes. He has, in recent months, scaled back to, I think his list is 40 correspondents. He's begun to realize that some of these people aren't really serious about getting to know him. Of course they're not. And so he's now scaled it back to people he considers his friends. And I guess I'm still on that list because we're still writing, but he gets an abundance of letters, absolutely.
I know this may be too soon to ask, and you write a lot of things, so with you still corresponding with him, would there be a possibility of a follow-up to your first book?
It depends on if there are any developments in other cases. Then there would be, of course, but there's no reason to write a sequel talking about what he does in his prison cell, actually. He'd like to have a book of his poetry published, and he'd like his memoirs of things that are not related to his murders published. That's not going to be what I do.
I'm gonna start to wrap this up, but I wanted to kind of go all the way back now. Whenever he was first writing to you, I know that at first you didn't think you were going to have, you know, the type of material that you'd want for a book. Talk a little bit about the types of things he was sending you originally before you really got him into the more important things that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I have hundreds of pages of stuff that did not get into the book primarily, and it took a while before he finally dug in and started doing what I consider work I could publish. At first, he wrote long essays, 20-page essays about his ancestors coming over from Germany and things that his grandparents had done, and like, okay, whatever. I mean, we had so much stuff to read through. At that time I had a student assistant who she helped me because she would transcribe some of it that I thought might be usable. But I had hundreds of pages that I didn't do anything with. He's a hypergraphic, is what I call it. It's hypergraphic. He likes to write long letters. He writes up the side of the margins at the top of the page. He'll write about anything and everything that's going on. What is he eating? What time did he get up? What's the moon phase? What birds does he see out his window? So there's a lot of room in his letters devoted to mundane things, that can't be used in a book like this. So